She is 72 years old. She gave up her home and her independence to move in with her son, believing that was what family was all about. Yet less than a week later, she was relegated to the basement. It wasn't for a lack of space. They simply wanted her to disappear while she was still alive. What they didn't know was that she held something in her hands, capable of destroying everything they had built. If you are watching this video, please hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss out on future shocking stories. Like the video and comment with the city or country you are watching from. I want to know just how my fearsome stories have traveled across the globe. I want to tell you something I've never said out loud to anyone. Not to my friends, not to my doctor, not even to the attorney who helped me rebuild everything afterward. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand in a finished basement surrounded by my own belongings and realize that the person who put me there called me his mother. I'm Marjorie Bennett. I'm 72 years old, and for 11 days, I lived in my son's basement like a secret he was ashamed of. This is how it happened. My husband Gerald died 6 years before any of this. Heart attack. Sudden, no warning. We were supposed to grow old together in the house we bought in 9987, the one with the maple tree out front, and the porch where we used to drink coffee in the mornings without saying much because we didn't need to. After 38 years of marriage, we had gotten very good at existing comfortably in the same silence. When he was gone, that silence became something else entirely. I stayed in the house for 4 years after Gerald passed. Kept myself busy. I had my routines, my garden, my Wednesday book club, a handful of close friends who checked in on me more than I probably deserved. I told myself I was fine, and for a while I even believed it. But fine is not the same as okay, and okay is not the same as whole. And somewhere around year 4, I started dreading winter mornings in a way I never had before. The house felt too big for one person. The porch didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like evidence. So when my son Ethan called me one evening in early March and said, "Mom, why don't you just come stay with us? We have the room. We'd love to have you." I said yes before I even thought it through. I should have thought it through. Ethan is my younger child. He's 44 years old, tall like his father, with Gerald's jaw and none of Gerald's steadiness. He married Vanessa 9 years ago, and I had made my peace with the fact that I would never fully understand her. She was polished in the way that certain women choose to be always the right outfit, always the right comment, always smiling, in a way that made you feel like you were being assessed rather than welcomed. I had told myself that was just her personality, that she was simply a private person, that it wasn't my place to judge. I had extended a lot of charity to Vanessa over the years. I would come to understand that she had extended very little to me. Their house was in a suburb about 40 minutes from where I had been living, one of those neighborhoods where the lawns are manicured to an almost aggressive degree, and everyone has a Ring doorbell. Strong opinion about HOA landscaping guidelines. The house itself was large and well decorated. Vanessa had real taste, I'll give her that. Everything was coordinated, intentional. There were throw pillows that probably cost more than my first month's rent had back in 1974. When I arrived on a Sunday afternoon in March, Vanessa greeted me at the door in a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks, like she was receiving a guest at a hotel rather than welcoming her mother-in-law home. She smiled and said, "Marjorie, we're so happy you're here, and I chose, as I had always done, to take that at face value." She showed me to the guest room. It was lovely. A real bed, a proper mattress, a window that looked out onto the backyard where the early spring light came through in the late afternoon. There was a small dresser, a little armchair by the window, and a closet that had been partially cleared out for me. It wasn't my room, it was clearly a guest room, decorated as such, with nothing personal to indicate anyone lived there, but it was comfortable. More than comfortable, and I told myself I was lucky. The bathroom is just down the hall, Vanessa told me. There's also one downstairs off the utility room, but this one's much nicer. We thought you'd prefer it. I smiled and said thank you. I did not yet understand that this was already a negotiation. The first few days were careful and pleasant in the way that first few days always are when people are trying to hold the shape of something that hasn't quite settled yet. Ethan came home from work around 6 each evening, and we would have dinner together, a real dinner, at the table, which I had not done consistently since Gerald died. There was conversation. There was laughter at some of it. There were moments that felt genuinely like what I had hoped this might be. But I have learned at 72 that hope can make you overlook a great deal. By Wednesday of the first week, the rules began to reveal themselves. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. They came in pieces, like small adjustments to an agreement I hadn't known I'd signed. Vanessa mentioned, in a friendly enough tone, that she preferred to keep the kitchen tidy after 8 in the evening because she wound down by preparing for the next morning, and if I needed anything after dinner. There were crackers and fruit in the pantry that I was welcome to. The way she said it so reasonable, so logistical made me nod, as though she had said something ordinary. But I stood in the hallway afterward and understood what had been communicated. The kitchen closes for you at 8. 2 days later, she mentioned that the guest bathroom, my bathroom, the nice one down the hall, was also where she stored extra linens and toiletries for when people came to visit. I hope it's not too much trouble, she said. But would it be easier for you to use the one downstairs? It's actually very clean. We keep it well. I said it was no trouble at all. I did not say, I've been using this bathroom for a week. I did not say, you told me this one was nicer. I did not say, what you're doing right now is taking something back that you offered me, and you're doing it so pleasantly that I'm supposed to be grateful. I went downstairs and looked at the bathroom by the utility room. It was clean. It was also barely larger than a closet, with a single overhead light that hummed faintly and a shelf lined with paint cans and extension cords. I used that bathroom from then on without saying a word about it. That was my first mistake, Ethan. I said that Thursday evening, when I managed to catch him alone in the garage while he was looking for something in one of his toolboxes. Can we talk for a minute? He looked up, and I saw the brief flicker of something cross his face. Not quite irritation, more like bracing. Like he already knew what this was about and had already decided how to respond. Sure, Mom, what's up? I feel like I'm getting in Vanessa's way, I said carefully. I chose that phrasing deliberately, not accusatory, not dramatic, just honest. I feel like there are a lot of rules I didn't know about before I came, and I don't want to make things uncomfortable. He set down the wrench he was holding. She just has a system, Mom. You know how it is. A system, I repeated. She keeps the house a certain way. It's not personal. She moved me to the downstairs bathroom, Ethan. It's a perfectly good bathroom. I looked at my son. This man whose diapers I had changed, whose fevers I had sat up through, whose high school heartbreaks I had listened to at midnight at the kitchen table. I looked at him and I thought, you know what's happening right now. And you have decided that it's easier not to say so. I just want to feel like I belong here, I said. That's all I'm asking. He picked the wrench back up and gave me a short nod. Just give it some time, Mom. It's an adjustment for everyone. An adjustment for everyone. That was what he gave me. I want you to understand something about the days that followed, because it's important that you feel what I felt, not just know it, but feel it. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being in a house full of people who have made a silent agreement not to see you. It is different from living alone. When you live alone, the absence is the whole thing. It's neutral. It's yours. It belongs to you. But when you are invisible in a house where other people are laughing and cooking and watching television and making plans, the loneliness has a texture. It presses against you. It makes every small exclusion feel deliberate. I began eating my meals in my room, not because anyone told me to, not yet, but because sitting at the kitchen table, while Vanessa moved around me with deliberate efficiency, had started to feel worse than the alternative. I told myself I was giving her space. I told myself it was fine. By the following Friday, everything I had convinced myself was fine fell apart in one evening. I came downstairs around 7 to get a glass of water. The guest room door was open. My door. The room with the window and the afternoon light and the small armchair I had started to think of mine. There was a woman inside. She was unpacking a suitcase onto the bed. I stood in the hallway and stared. Ethan appeared from the kitchen with a glass of wine in his hand. Oh, Mom. Hey, I meant to tell you, Vanessa's sister is visiting for a while. We moved your things, you moved my things. Yeah, we set you up downstairs. It's actually pretty comfortable down there. We're downstairs, Ethan. He paused just long enough for me to understand what he was about to say before he said it. The basement. We've got it set up for you. There's a bed, there's a TV, I stopped listening. I walked past him, down the hall, and found the door to the basement stairs. I opened it. I walked down. What I found at the bottom of those stairs would be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. Not because it was horrible in a dramatic sense, because it was so precisely, specifically degrading in a way that told me exactly what my son thought of me. A folding table, one of those cheap plastic ones they use at church potlucks. A narrow bed that I recognized from the spare room at our old house, a bed I had purchased for when grandchildren visited, meant for a child, with a mattress that bowed in the center. Television set on a plastic crate, a small lamp, the furnace humming 6 feet away. My boxes were stacked against the wall, all of them. Every piece of clothing, every photograph, every small thing I had brought from my life, packed into boxes and moved while I was somewhere else in the house, without my knowledge, without my permission, without so much as a conversation. I stood in that basement for a long time. Then I went back upstairs, walked to the kitchen where Ethan and Vanessa were standing together at the counter, and I said, as steadily as I could manage, "Did either of you ask me before you moved my belongings?" Vanessa turned around with a smile that had about as much warmth as a contract. "We thought you'd be more comfortable with more privacy," she said. "It's really quite a nice setup." "You moved me to the basement," I said. "I want to hear you say that." The smile didn't waver. "We gave you your own space, Ethan." I turned to my son. "Do you have anything to say to me?" He looked at his wine glass. He looked at his wife. He looked at some point on the counter between them. "Mom, Vanessa's sister needed a room. It's base clean. I'm your mother," I said. "I left my home to come here because you told me I was family. You moved me to the basement without asking me. Do you understand how that feels?" Something crossed his face. I still believe I have to believe that it was something like shame. But whatever it was, Vanessa's hand found his arm, and whatever he might have said next died somewhere in his throat. "Let's just get through the week," he said. "Everyone's tired." I walked back downstairs. I sat on the edge of that narrow bed, in the sound of the furnace, and I made myself breathe slowly and carefully, the way you do when you are trying very hard not to come apart in a place where no one will help you put yourself back together. I did not cry. I was too angry to cry, and under the anger was something colder and more clear than anger. Kind of settling, a reckoning. I thought about what Ethan didn't know. What neither of them knew about me, about my finances, about the things Gerald and I had built together, and the things I had built alone after he was gone. I had kept those things private for reasons I had once thought were sentimental. Sitting in that basement, I started to understand that my silence had been, without my knowing it, a kind of protection. They had placed me in a basement because they believed I had no leverage. They were wrong, but I wasn't ready to show them that yet. Not yet. I lay back on the child's mattress and stared at the ceiling of my son's basement, and I thought, I will not let this be the end of my story. I just had to figure out what came next. I slept badly that first night in the basement. That shouldn't surprise anyone. A narrow mattress that dipped in the middle, a furnace that kicked on every 40 minutes with a sound like someone clearing their throat in the dark, and the particular silence of a house above you, where people are going about their evening as though you don't exist. I lay there, listening to footsteps cross the floor overhead. Vanessa's heels, she wore them even inside, which I had always found strange. Ethan's heavier tread, moving from the kitchen to the living room. The muffled sound of a television. Laughter, once, brief and bright, from somewhere that felt very far away. I was directly below the people I loved. I had never felt more alone in my life. At some point after midnight, I stopped trying to sleep and sat up on the edge of that child's mattress, with my feet on the cold concrete floor, and I allowed myself to think clearly about my situation. Not emotionally, I had given myself enough of that in the hours immediately after they'd moved me down here. I mean practically, strategically. The way Gerald used to think when something went wrong, he'd get very quiet, very still, and he'd work the problem from every angle until he found the one that held. Gerald was the steadiest person I ever knew. He was also the one who taught me, early in our marriage, that a woman who keeps her own financial affairs in order is a woman nobody can corner. He didn't say it in those terms. Gerald wasn't given to speeches. He said it once, plainly, while we were sitting at the dining table, going over paperwork, after we bought our second property. He said, "Marjorie, make sure your name is always on things. Make sure you always know what you have." I had listened. I had done exactly that for 38 years of marriage, and then for 6 more years on my own, after he was gone. What Ethan did not know, what neither he nor Vanessa had thought to ask about, because they had never been genuinely curious about my life, was the full picture of what I had built. It had started with Gerald's life insurance. When he died, the payout was significant, not life-changing, in the way people imagine, but enough, if handled carefully, to work with. I had not spent it on grief, which is what some people do without meaning to. I had invested most of it on the advice of a financial advisor named Paulette, who had managed my accounts for 11 years and who remained one of the sharpest people I knew. I had kept our rental property a duplex in an older part of town that Gerald and I had purchased in our 50s as a retirement income strategy, and I had added to it over time. A small commercial building 2 years after Gerald died, bought at a price that made Paulette raise an eyebrow in pleasant surprise. Then a decent residential property the following year, when the market offered a window that I recognized and moved through quickly. By the time I moved into Ethan's basement, I owned 4 properties outright. No mortgages, no debt. They generated income every month while I slept, or in this case, while I failed to sleep on a folding cot beside a furnace. What I had never told Ethan, and this is the part that requires some explanation, was not an accident. It was a choice I had made deliberately, several years before any of this, for a reason that had nothing to do with secrecy, and everything to do with love. I had watched what money did to family. I had watched it at close range with Gerald's brother Franklin, who had spent the last decade of their parents' lives orbiting them with the focused attention of a man waiting for something. Franklin had called every Sunday. Franklin had shown up for every holiday. Franklin had been warm and present and solicitous right up until the will was read, and then the warmth had evaporated like morning dew in July. It had broken Gerald's heart in a way he never entirely recovered from. He had loved his brother. He had wanted to believe the attention was real. I had not wanted that for myself. So I made a choice, after Gerald died, to allow my children to love me or not love me, without the complication of knowing what I was worth. My daughter Claire, who lives in Portland with her husband and 2 teenagers, and who calls me every Sunday without fail, she didn't know either. Not the full scope of it. She knew I was comfortable. She didn't know the details, and she had never pushed, because Claire has always been the kind of person who respects a closed door. Ethan had never seemed particularly interested in asking. I had once thought that was because he loved me for my own sake. Sitting in his basement, I was revising that interpretation. The thing about the commercial building, the specific one I need to tell you about, is that it sat on the corner of Aldrich and 5th in a small commercial strip, about 12 minutes from Ethan's house. It was a solid brick building, built in the 60s, with 3 ground-floor retail spaces and 2 small offices above. I had purchased it because the price was right and the location had bones, and I had a good feeling about the neighborhood trajectory. That feeling had turned out to be correct. One of those ground-floor retail spaces, the largest one, had been leased for the past 3 years to a women's clothing boutique called Lane. It was a pretty shop. I had walked past it a few times and noticed the window displays, which were tasteful and well-composed. The kind of shop that attracted a certain clientele, the kind who spent serious money on things that looked effortless. Lane was owned and operated by Vanessa. My daughter-in-law's boutique existed in a space that I owned. She had been paying rent, monthly, to a property management company I used, and the management company processed the payments and deposited them to my accounts without any identifying information about the property owner being invisible standard tenant communications. Vanessa knew her landlord as Aldrich Properties LLC. She did not know that Aldrich Properties LLC was, in all the ways that mattered, me. I want to be very precise about something here, because I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that it sounds like I had set some kind of trap. I had not. I had purchased that building before Vanessa signed her lease. I had not sought out Ethan's wife as a tenant. The world is smaller than we think, and sometimes circumstances arrange themselves into shapes that look like design, but are actually just geography. Vanessa had found the space, negotiated a lease through a commercial real estate agent, and moved in without any of us knowing the connection. My property manager had flagged the tenant name to me when the lease was being finalized, and I had felt a complicated twist of something amusement, maybe, or the quiet vertigo of coincidence, and I had decided to say nothing. Not out of malice, because I had wanted to see what happened, because I had wanted the information to exist somewhere, held by me, untouched, for as long as it needed to be. I had not known that it would matter the way it did. I had not predicted any of this, but I had held on to it, and now I was sitting in a basement with a furnace for company, and I understood with a clarity that surprised me that I was not as powerless as they believed. I did not sleep that night, but by morning, something in me had hardened into a shape I recognized. It wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to resolve. The days that followed had a strange double quality to them. On the surface, I was the diminished thing they had decided I should be, the elderly mother who had been relocated downstairs, who appeared occasionally for glasses of water and was otherwise easily ignored. I ate breakfast alone. I watched the morning light move across the small basement window, a rectangle of gray-white sky that showed me a few inches of the backyard and nothing else. I took short walks around the neighborhood in the late mornings, telling myself it was for the exercise, knowing it was because I could not breathe properly in that house. But underneath all of that, I was paying attention in a way I had not allowed them to see. I listened, I observed. I let them forget I was there, which turned out to be remarkably easy because they had already forgotten I was there. People reveal themselves when they believe they are unobserved. Ethan and Vanessa, going about their daily lives above me, began to reveal themselves in increments. The first thing I noticed was the money talk. Not fighting Ethan and Vanessa didn't fight. Exactly. Or at least not loudly. What they did was negotiate constantly in the low-pressure tones of people who have made finance into the primary language of their marriage. I would hear fragments when I was in the stairwell, or when a conversation carried through the vent near the furnace that fed into the kitchen above. They were extended. That much was clear. Their lifestyle, the house, the cars, Vanessa's boutique, which I had come to understand, was not performing as well as she presented it, publicly had outpaced their actual income. One evening, about a week into my basement residency, I heard Ethan say something that stopped me in the middle of folding a blouse. "The boutique needs another infusion," he said. His voice was clear through the vent. "Vanessa, we've talked about this. I know what I need," she said. "I just need another few months to stabilize the inventory. The summer season, we don't have another few months of runway. Not at this level. A pause, some movement, a drawer, or a cabinet. There are other options we haven't fully explored." "You mean your mother?" "Silence, Ethan. I'm not saying anything specific," he said. "I'm saying there are options. She has money. She has property. You've said yourself she doesn't really, that she doesn't have the kind of plans that would. Can we just not do this tonight? I'm just saying. She came here voluntarily. She's comfortable. And at some point, when the time is right, it makes sense to have a conversation about how things will eventually." "Vanessa, it's not wrong to think about it, Ethan." Another silence. Longer this time. "No," he said finally. "It's not wrong to think about it." I set the blouse down on the folding table and sat very still. I had suspected this, in the vague, uncomfortable way you suspect things you don't want to confirm. Hearing it said in their voices, in those practical, reasonable tones, it was different. It was the difference between fearing something and knowing it. They weren't looking at me and seeing their mother. They were looking at me and seeing an asset that hadn't been properly organized yet. I pressed my back against the wall and breathed slowly, and I thought, so that's what this is. That was the second week. By the third week, the architecture of my new life had settled into something almost routine, which is itself a remarkable thing, how quickly human beings normalize the intolerable when they feel they have no other choice. I got up every morning and made myself presentable, because my mother had taught me that your appearance on your worst days matters more than on your best ones, and I was not going to let these people see me diminished in ways I could control. I wore real clothes. I put on a little makeup. I kept my corner of that basement orderly, because the alternative, the visual confirmation of a life in boxes, was something I refused to give them. But the cracks were showing. I could feel them. The walk up to the main floor bathroom had become a small daily negotiation. I had learned Vanessa's schedule well enough to move through the house during the windows when she was least likely to encounter May, not because I was hiding, but because every accidental meeting had a texture to it that wore me down. Vanessa had a gift for making me feel like an inconvenience without ever saying anything that could be directly addressed. A slightly too long pause when I appeared in the kitchen. An almost imperceptible shift in her posture when I sat near her. Small things. The kind of things that reported to someone else sound like nothing. The kind of things that experience daily, feel like being slowly pressed flat. Ethan, for his part, had settled into a strategy of cheerful deflection that I found almost more painful than Vanessa's coldness. He would appear at the top of the basement stairs every few days with a determined brightness. "Hey Mom, how are you doing? Getting enough to eat? You need anything?" In the voice of someone who has convinced himself that asking the question satisfies the same requirement as actually listening to the answer. I would say I was fine. He would nod, relieved, and disappear back upstairs. There was one afternoon that broke through all of that, like a stone through glass. I had come up to use the kitchen. It was just past noon. Vanessa was at the boutique. Ethan was at work. The house was empty, and I allowed myself to make a proper lunch for once. A real sandwich, tomato soup from a can, a glass of iced tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the good afternoon light and ate slowly and tried to remember what it had felt like to be a person who belonged somewhere. I was clearing my dishes when I heard the front door open. It wasn't Ethan. It was Vanessa's sister, Kristen, who had been the reason ostensibly for my relocation to the basement. She was around 35, thin and faintly anxious looking, in the way of people who have been told their whole lives that they need to keep up with someone. She stopped when she saw me, and something moved across her face, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. "Oh," she said. "Hi, Marjorie." "Hello, Kristen." She set her bag on the counter and went to the refrigerator. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, without turning around, "Are you okay down there? In the basement?" It was such a direct question, asked so quietly, that I didn't know what to do with it for a moment. "It's fine," I said. "It's not fine," she said. She closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter, looking at me with an expression that I could only describe as uncomfortable honesty. "I want you to know I didn't ask for your room. I told Vanessa I could stay at a hotel. She said it was already arranged." I looked at my glass of iced tea. "I appreciate you telling me that." "It's not right," Kristen said. She said it simply, with the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to talk around things. "You're his mother. You shouldn't be." She stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to make it worse." "You're not making it worse," I said. "Worse already happened." She nodded once, and then she took her things and went upstairs, and I stood in the kitchen alone for a moment longer than I needed to. Even Vanessa's sister knew. Even someone who had been in the house for less than 2 weeks could see it clearly, which meant it was real and visible and not something I had constructed from the wrong end of my own emotions. That conversation settled something in me. The following Tuesday, I made a phone call. I waited until well after 9 in the evening, when I could hear the television going upstairs, and I was certain of reasonable privacy, and I sat on the edge of that narrow bed and called Paulette. She answered on the third ring. "Marjorie." "It's late." "I know," I said. "I need to talk to you about the Aldrich building." A brief pause. "What about it?" "I need a full accounting of the current lease terms on Unit 1, the retail space, all of it renewal options, notice requirements, breach clauses, everything." Another pause longer. Paulette had been managing my finances for 11 years. She knew when I was asking an academic question, and when I was asking because I needed to know what my options were. "Are you all right?" "I'm in a basement," I said. "I'm sorry?" "My son's basement. I moved in with him 6 weeks ago, and they put me in the basement." I said it flat and plain, without the wobble I'd been fighting for days. "And the woman who runs the boutique in Unit 1 is his wife." Paulette was quiet for so long that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. "Marjorie," she finally said, "I know." "Does she know? Does he know about—" "No," I said. "Neither of them." "And you want to know what your position is?" "I want to know everything," I said. "All of it. Every number, every clause, every piece of paper with my name on it. I want to understand exactly where I stand." I could hear Paulette turning something over in her mind. She was not a dramatic person. She dealt in facts and figures and legal language, and she was very good at her job precisely because she didn't let sentiment interfere with clarity. But when she spoke again, there was something in her voice I hadn't often heard from her. "I'll have a full report to you by Thursday," she said. "And Marjorie, you might also want to call an attorney. Not for any particular reason yet, just to know who to call." "I already have someone in mind," I said. "Good." Another pause. "For what it's worth, if what you're describing is accurate, you are not without recourse." I thanked her and hung up. I sat in the sound of the furnace for a while, not thinking about anything very specific, just existing in that space, in that strange pocket of time between what had been done to me and what I was beginning, quietly and carefully to prepare. There is something I want to say about this period, because I think it matters. I was not plotting revenge. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy and perhaps more satisfying to tell this as a story about a woman who outwitted people who underestimated her. And that is partly true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was scared. I was 67 years old in a basement, and my son was upstairs calculating whether I was useful to him, and I was frightened in a way that had nothing to do with money. I was frightened that the person I had raised had become someone I didn't recognize, and that the years of love and presence and sacrifice that I had poured into him had not protected us from arriving at this moment. That fear did not leave me. It lived alongside everything else, the practicalities, the phone calls, the careful arithmetic of my position. A mother's fear for her child doesn't go away simply because that child has caused her harm. That's the part that nobody tells you. That's the part that made all of this so much harder than it looks from the outside. But I had to keep moving. The report from Paulette came on Thursday as promised, delivered to my email in a clean PDF that I read on my phone lying on that folding cot at 11 o'clock at night. She had compiled everything: the 4 properties and their current valuations, the income streams, the lease terms on all 3 units of the Aldrich building. Unit 1, Vanessa's Boutique, was on a 3-year lease with 8 months remaining. There was no automatic renewal clause. Notice of termination could be issued 90 days before expiry. I read that section 3 times. Then I've read the section where Paulette had noted, in her careful accountant's language, that based on current market rates for comparable commercial spaces in that corridor, a lease renewal negotiation would likely involve a rate increase of somewhere between 20 and 35%. Without a renewal, the tenant would need to vacate and find alternative space in a market that had tightened considerably in the past 18 months. I set the phone down on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. I thought about Vanessa saying, she has property, she doesn't have the kind of plans that would, and stopping herself. I thought about Ethan looking at his wine glass when he should have been looking at me. I thought about the folding table and the plastic crate and the rectangle of gray sky outside my window. They had put me in a basement because they believed I was dependent on them, because they believed I was an aging widow who needed their roof and their charity, and who could be managed, repositioned, diminished by degrees until she signed whatever papers were eventually placed in front of her. They had built their entire strategy on a foundation of assumptions they had never thought to verify. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because that is the thing that strikes me most. Even now, looking back, not the cruelty of what they did, but the laziness underneath the cruelty. They had never asked about my life. They had never been curious about who I was outside of my relationship to them. They had looked at an older woman and seen a simplified version of her, stripped of history and agency and interior life, and they had made plans based on that simplified version. And that simplified version was so far from the truth that it wasn't even in the same county. The week after Paulette's report, something shifted in how I moved through the house. Not dramatically, I didn't become cold or confrontational, because I had not decided yet what I was going to do, and because I needed to understand more before I acted. But I stopped shrinking. Tiny adjustments, invisible from the outside. I stopped eating all my meals in the basement. I started coming up to the kitchen in the evenings, even when Vanessa was there, and making myself tea and sitting at the table for 20 minutes before going back downstairs. She would tighten visibly and say nothing. I said nothing either. I simply sat there and drank my tea and was present in her house in a way she could not politely object to without revealing what she actually thought of me. It was a small thing, but small things compound. One evening, Ethan came home from work while I was sitting at the kitchen table with my tea, and he stopped in the doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite achieving it. Vanessa was at the counter with her back to both of us, making something that required a great deal of attention to the cutting board. "Hey, Mom," Ethan said, with the careful brightness I had come to recognize. "You're up here, I live here," I said pleasantly. Something shifted in his face. "Of course you do. I made extra water if you want tea," I said. "The kettle's still hot." He looked at Vanessa. She didn't turn around. "Sure," he said after a moment. "That'd be nice." He poured himself a cup and stood awkwardly by the counter for a moment, not quite sitting down, not quite leaving, And I watched him exist in that discomfort. And I thought, you created this. Every awkward inch of it. But I didn't say that. I just drank my tea. How are things at work? I asked him. He started talking about work. He talked for 7 minutes. I tracked it vaguely by the clock on the microwave, and I listened and asked the occasional question. And Vanessa remained at the cutting board with her back to us, and it was the most normal 7 minutes I had experienced in weeks. Normal in the way of something that used to be easy, that has now become an effort, but still, there it was. When he finished talking, there was a pause, and then he said, in a different register quieter, something almost like a real voice instead of the careful one he'd been using, Mom. Are you doing okay down there? I looked at him. No, I said. I'm not, really. He nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer but had hoped for a different one. We should talk, he said. We should, I said. We didn't talk that night. Something interrupted Vanessa. Asked him a question about a contractor they were dealing with, and the moment dissolved, and he drifted back into the gravity of his own domestic life. But it had happened, he had asked. I had answered, honestly, for the first time since I'd arrived. I didn't know yet if that meant anything. I went back downstairs and sat in my basement and thought about Gerald, who had been gone 6 years and who would have had very specific feelings about all of this. He had not been a man given to confrontation, but he had also not been a man who would have allowed his mother to sleep beside a furnace without saying something clear and direct about it. He would have been ashamed. Not loudly, Gerald's shame was always quiet, always turned inward, but it would have been there. I missed him in the particular way you miss someone when something happens that they would have known how to handle, and you are left handling it alone. But I was handling it. I reminded myself of that. I was handling it. I had made the calls. I had the information. I understood my position better than they understood theirs, and I was deciding, carefully, what to do next. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing yet, was that the following Saturday would take the decision out of my hands. Because Saturday was the dinner. And the dinner was when I finally heard, in full, what they had been planning. Saturday arrived the way difficult days often do, quietly, with no particular warning in the quality of the light or the sound of the house, nothing to indicate that by the end of it, everything would be different. I had known about the dinner since Thursday. Not because anyone had told me directly, but because I had learned, over the weeks in that basement, to read the household the way you learn to read weather through accumulation of small signs, rather than any single clear signal. There had been a grocery delivery Friday morning, larger than usual. Vanessa had spent most of Friday evening in the kitchen, which was unusual for her. And on Saturday afternoon, while I was sitting in my corner of the basement, with a book I was only pretending to read, I heard the specific sounds of a house being prepared for company, the vacuum, the rearrangement of furniture, the particular quality of Vanessa's voice when she was giving instructions to someone who wasn't quite executing her vision correctly. What I didn't know was who was coming or why I was not invited. I found out about the second part when Ethan appeared at the top of the basement stairs at 4:30 and said, in his carefully calibrated, cheerful voice, "Hey, Mom, we've got some people coming over tonight. Probably easier if you just hung out downstairs, okay? It won't be a late one." I set my book down. I looked up at him. He was already in his dress shirt, already in the particular posture of a man preparing to be impressive to people outside his own family, and he had come to tell me, in those exact words, probably easier if you just hung out downstairs, that I was to make myself invisible while he entertained. Easier for who? I asked. He had the decency to look at the doorframe rather than at me. Just a business thing. Some guys from my firm and their wives. It's not the right night for. He stopped. Searched for something. For introductions. For introductions, I repeated. Mom, go get ready for your dinner, I said. He looked at me for one more second, and then he was gone. The door pulled most of the way closed behind him, and I sat in the sound of the furnace and breathed through the slow, deliberate burn of what it felt like to be told, by your own child, that tonight was not the right night for you to exist in his home. I was 72 years old. I had raised that man. I had held him through fevers and heartbreaks and failures, and I had cheered him through every good thing that had happened to him. And he had come to the basement door to let me know I wasn't suitable for company. I sat with that feeling for a long time. The guests arrived at 7. I could hear them through the vent, voices, multiplying, the particular elevated energy of a social gathering, the kind that's been cultivated carefully because everyone present knows it matters professionally. 6 people, maybe 8, from the sound of it. Good wine being opened. Vanessa's laugh, which was different in company, brighter and rounder, the kind of laugh that performs its own ease. I told myself I didn't care. I made myself a cup of tea on the little electric kettle I had plugged in down here after the kitchen became increasingly hostile territory, and I sat on the edge of my cot and stared at the television without turning it on. And then, sometime around 8:30, I heard Vanessa's voice move through the kitchen above me and stop near the vent. She was not alone. Another voice, a woman's, lower, with the crisp confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Colleague's wife, I would later understand, named Darlene. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I want to be clear about that. The acoustics of that basement, combined with the vent placement near the furnace, made the kitchen directly above me the clearest possible audio channel in the house. I had not sought it out. But I also, once I understood what I was hearing, did not stop listening. Your boutique is in the Aldrich building, isn't it? Darlene was saying. My sister looked at a space there last year. Unit 1, Vanessa said. There was a pleased quality to her voice. The boutique was always a source of pride, regardless of what the actual numbers looked like. We're in the corner space. Best light in the whole building. Is your lease up soon? 8 months, Vanessa said. But we're not worried about it. The ownership situation is a pause. A shift in her voice, lower now, private, the register of something being shared as a confidence. Going to be manageable. What do you mean? Ethan's mother owns property, Vanessa said. A lot of it, actually, from what we've been piecing together. More than she ever let on. Another pause. She moved in with us a few weeks ago. She's getting older, you know. She needs the support. And it makes sense, eventually, for the family to have a clearer understanding of what she has. I heard the soft sound of wine being poured. Once she's had time to settle in, Vanessa continued, we're going to get her to sit down with an attorney. Ethan has one in mind, and look at how we can streamline some of the estate. For her benefit, obviously. She's not getting any younger, and managing properties on your own at her age isn't a lot. She'll want someone she trusts overseeing things. And he'd have oversight, yes. It's really just about protecting her. Vanessa's voice was smooth and perfectly assembled, and if I had not been listening through the sharp prism of weeks in a basement, I might have almost believed it. The boutique lease, the other properties, once things are structured properly, it all simplifies. The right thing for everyone. That's very thoughtful of you, Darlene said, in the tone of a woman who has attended enough dinner parties to understand when a comment is expected rather than genuine. Family comes first, Vanessa said. And then they moved away from the vent, back toward the dinner table, and their voices dissolved into the general sound of the party above me, and I was left sitting on the edge of my cot, with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, very still in the humming silence of that basement. I need to try to explain what it felt like to hear that, because I don't want to flatten it into something simple. It was not purely shock. I had suspected something like this, had circled around it in my thoughts since the night I'd overheard them in the kitchen talking about other options. It was not purely anger, though anger was certainly present, moving through me with a heat and a focus that I recognized from very few moments in my life. What it was, more than anything, was a kind of arriving. Like I had been walking toward this knowledge for weeks without knowing it, and now I had gotten there, and I was standing in it, and there was a strange clarity to it that was almost worse than the anger. They had not put me in the basement because they had run out of room. They had put me in the basement because isolated people are easier to manage. Everything the rules about the kitchen, the bathroom reassignment, the social invisibility, the dinner tonight, the closed door at the top of the stairs, all of it had been a deliberate architecture. A system designed to make me feel small and dependent and vaguely ashamed of taking up space, so that when the time came for Ethan to sit across from me with papers and an attorney and a carefully constructed explanation about why it was all for my own good, I would be soft enough to sign. The basement wasn't an accommodation. The basement was a strategy. I sat with that understanding and let it move through me completely. Then I set down my tea, stood up, and went to the box in the corner where I had packed the documents I had brought from home. Organized, labeled, the way Gerald had taught me, the way I had maintained them for 40 years. I found what I needed within 4 minutes. I placed the papers in a plain manila folder. I smoothed my clothes, checked my reflection in the small mirror I'd propped against the wall, and confirmed that I looked like exactly what I was, a composed woman in her 70s who was about to walk upstairs. I was not shaking. I want to be precise about that, because I was aware of it, in the moment aware that my hands were steady, and my breathing was even, and I think it was because the fear had burned off, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, and been replaced by something cleaner. Something that felt, underneath everything, like the first solid ground I'd stood on in weeks. Put my hand on the basement door and opened it. The dinner party was at full volume. 8 people around the dining table, the good china out, candles, the kind of carefully managed atmosphere that Vanessa produced the way other people breathe. Someone was in the middle of a story about a ski trip. There was laughter building toward a punchline. I walked through the kitchen and into the dining room, and everything stopped. Not all at once, it was more like a wave moving through the table. Each person becoming aware of my presence in sequence, the conversation dropping away in sections until the whole room was quiet and 8 people were looking at me with various expressions of surprise. Ethan, at the head of the table, went a color I can only describe as the particular gray-white of someone whose body has recognized a problem before their brain has. "Mom," he said. The word came out flat, emptied of the careful brightness he usually managed. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, which was the most genuinely polite thing I could have opened with, and I meant it. The other people at the table had done nothing to me, and I was not unaware that what I was about to do would be uncomfortable for everyone present. But some things cannot wait for a more convenient moment. Some things need to happen in a room full of witnesses. I walked to the dining table and placed the manila folder on the white tablecloth between the bread basket and a half-empty bottle of wine. "Ethan," I said, "I'd like to show you something." He was staring at the folder. His jaw had done something complicated. Vanessa, across the table, was very still in the specific way of a person recalibrating rapidly. "Mom, this isn't we have guests." "I know," I said. "I heard you had guests. I also heard some of what was discussed in the kitchen this evening. I did not look at Darlene. I did not need to. So I thought it would be a good time to clarify a few things. Marjorie." Vanessa's voice had a new quality in it, not quite the smooth social polish, and not quite open alarm, somewhere between the two, like a foundation starting to shift. "This isn't appropriate. I agree that a lot of what's happened in this house recently has not been appropriate," I said. "But let's talk about the folder." I opened it on the table. I turned the first document so it faced Ethan, and placed my finger on the relevant line at the top. "Do you recognize this address?" I asked him. He looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes move to the address, and I watched them stop there, and I watched the specific moment when his brain connected what he was reading to something he already knew. His face did not change dramatically. Ethan had always been better at managing his expressions than Vanessa's, but something behind his eyes went very quiet. The address was the Aldrich building. The document was the property deed. My name was on it, in the clear, unambiguous typography of a legal document that has never been disputed and does not intend to be. "This is the building at Aldrich and 5th, I said. "I purchased it 4 years ago. It is mine outright, no encumbrances." I turned to the next document. "This is the lease for Unit 1 of that building, the primary retail space." I placed it beside the deed. "Do you know who holds that lease?" The room was absolutely silent. I was aware, peripherally, of the other 6 people at the table, the men who worked with Ethan, their wives sitting in a stillness that had moved past social discomfort into something closer to genuine attention. They were watching this happen. Ethan said nothing. Vanessa said very quietly, "That's not possible." "It's entirely possible," I said. "It's a matter of public record, if you'd like to verify it. The tenant in Unit 1 is a boutique called Lane. The lease expires in 8 months. The property owner is Aldrich Properties LLC, which is registered to me." I paused. "Your boutique exists in a building that I own, Vanessa. You have been paying me rent for 3 years." The sound that came from Vanessa in that moment was not a word. It was something more primal than a word, a sharp, involuntary exhale, the sound of someone whose internal map of a situation has just been torn away. She stopped. Started again. "You never said anything." "No," I said, "I didn't. You knew, you've known this entire time, and you never—" "I purchased that building before you signed your lease," I said. "I didn't arrange the coincidence, Vanessa. The world is smaller than we think. But yes, I've known. And I kept it to myself because I was waiting to understand whether the people in this house cared about me or about what I might eventually be convinced to give them. I let that sit for a moment. I needed it to sit. Then I turned back to the folder and placed two more documents on the table: the consolidated statement of my holdings, which Paulette had prepared, and the letter from my attorney acknowledging his current representation of me in all estate matters. I also own a duplex on Carmichael Street, I said, a residential property on the east side, and another small commercial unit. All of it is currently held in a structure that my attorney has been advising me on, and none of it is accessible without my explicit consent, which is documented and legally protected. Ethan had not moved. He was looking at the papers on the table with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something that combined shock and shame, and something I couldn't quite name but recognized in the way. You recognize a face you haven't seen in a long time. He looked, for the first time in weeks, like the person I used to know. "Mom," he said. His voice had changed entirely. The dinner party brightness was gone. The careful management was gone. What was left was quieter and smaller, and more real than anything he had said to me in the past several weeks. "I didn't know. You didn't ask," I said. He closed his eyes briefly. "You told me I was family," I continued. "You told me I would be taken care of. And within a week you had moved me to the basement and arranged your social life around my invisibility. And I heard your wife tell a guest this evening that you were planning to get me in front of an attorney to streamline the estate. For my benefit. Isn't that how she put it?" Vanessa made a sound. "I didn't look at her, Ethan," I said. "Look at me." He did, and I saw it, the thing I had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure, the thing I had been watching for across weeks of closed doors and careful maneuvering. I saw that some part of him understood exactly what had happened, and that some part of him was ashamed of it, not in the abstract way people are ashamed of things they've been caught doing, but in a deeper way. The way you're ashamed of something you knew was wrong while you were doing it. That didn't fix anything. Shame is not the same as repair. But it mattered to me that it was there. "You didn't make me feel like family," I said. "You made me feel like an obstacle between you and an inheritance. And I want you to understand that I know the difference, even when you thought I didn't." The table was so quiet that I could hear the candles. One of the other couples, I didn't know which one, I wasn't looking at them, made the small shifting sound of people who are trying to decide whether they should say something or remain invisible. They remained invisible. That was the correct choice. Vanessa was staring at the documents on the table. Her face had gone through several configurations in the last few minutes and had settled on something I could only describe as a controlled collapse, the expression of someone who is working very hard to hold their composure. Together, while something underneath it comes apart. She was looking at the lease document the way people look at a piece of news that cannot be unread. "The boutique," she said. It came out with a strange flatness. "The lease is in 8 months. "Yes," I said. She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. And that was the truth. I had not come upstairs with a plan. I had come upstairs because I could not spend one more night in that basement, pretending that what was happening was anything other than what it was. That's a conversation for another time. Marjorie Vanessa started. "I'm not angry with you," I said. And even as I said it, I recognized that it was partially true, and partially not. I was angry. I had been angry for weeks, but underneath the anger was something sadder and more complicated that I didn't have words for yet. "I'm disappointed." "That's different." "I'm disappointed in both of you, for reasons that have nothing to do with these papers." Ethan had his head down. His hands were flat on the tablecloth. One of his colleagues was examining his wine glass with the focused attention of a man who deeply wishes he were somewhere else. "I'm going to go back downstairs," I said. "I think that's best for everyone's evening. But I want you both to know that I understand exactly what has been happening in this house and what was being planned, and I want you to sit with that knowledge tonight." I picked up the folder. I looked at my son one more time, at this man who was Gerald's jaw and Gerald's height, and someone I no longer fully recognized, and I said the last thing. "I loved you without conditions," I said. "I never needed you to earn it. I just needed you not to use it. And you used it, Ethan. You let it happen right in front of you." He looked up. His eyes were wet. Not crying Ethan was too controlled for that, in company, but the edges were bright in the way that happens before tears, and he looked. At that moment, genuinely young, genuinely lost. And I felt the thing that I always feel when I see my children reduced to their most vulnerable, which is love stubborn, inconvenient, not yet extinguished, alongside the grief of knowing that love had not been enough to prevent any of this. I walked back through the kitchen and down the basement stairs and closed the door behind me. My legs gave out a little when I sat down on the cot. Not dramatically, I didn't fall. I didn't collapse. Just a sudden absence of the steadiness that had carried me through the last 40 minutes. The body catching up to what the mind had been running on. I put my hands on my knees and breathed carefully and looked at the wall. Above me, I could hear the dinner party trying to reconstitute itself. Voices lower than before, the scrape of a chair. What sounded like someone saying goodbye earlier than planned. Vanessa's voice, tight and bright, performing recovery. I sat and listened to my son's house rearrange itself around what I had just done, and I was not triumphant. That is important to say. There was no satisfaction in the room with me. What was there was exhaustion and grief, and the particular weariness of someone who has done something necessary and difficult, and knows that the difficult part is not over. Because here is what I understood, sitting there. What I had done upstairs was not an ending. It was a beginning. The papers on the table were not a weapon, they were a reckoning, and reckonings don't resolve themselves in a single dinner party scene. They open things. They crack the shell of a situation and expose what's underneath, and what's underneath is always messier, and more painful and more human than the shell suggested. Ethan was going to want to talk to me. Vanessa was going to be afraid. The lease was going to need to be addressed, the estate matters resolved, the entire architecture of my life reorganized to reflect who I actually was rather than who they had decided I should be. All of that was ahead of me. But something else was ahead of me too, and I let myself hold on to that as I sat in the basement that would not be my basement much longer. I had walked up those stairs. I had placed the papers on the table. I had said the true thing out loud, in front of witnesses, in a room where nobody could later claim they hadn't understood. 72 years old in my son's basement, with a furnace for company and a foam mattress that bowed in the middle, and I had walked up those stairs and told the truth. It was not enough, but it was something. It was, I realized, as the voices above me finally went quiet and the dinner party ended, and the house settled into its nighttime sounds, the first truly free thing I had done since I arrived. I lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning. And sometime before dawn, Ethan knocked on the basement door. He didn't open it, just knocked, and then said, through the wood, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was about 19 and had made a bad decision and needed to tell me about it, Mom. I'm sorry, I don't know how to fix this, but I'm sorry. I lay there and listened to him say it. And then I heard him walk back to his bedroom, and I lay in the dark for a long time, holding the complicated weight of two things being true at once, that his apology was real, and that an apology, by itself, was nowhere near enough. I did not sleep after Ethan's knock. Not really. I drifted in and out of something shallow and unsatisfying, the kind of half-sleep where you're aware of the room around you the entire time and your mind keeps pulling you back to the surface to process things that aren't finished yet. At some point, the light through the basement window shifted from black to gray to the pale flat white of early morning, and I gave up on sleep entirely and sat up and put my feet on the cold concrete floor and let myself be awake. The house above me was silent. Whatever Ethan had done after knocking on my door, whether he'd slept, or sat in this dark like me, or gone to Vanessa and described what he'd said and listened, to whatever she made of it, I didn't know. I only knew that the knock had happened, and that the 3 words he'd said through the wood were still sitting in me, somewhere between my chest and my throat, not dissolved, not resolved, just present. I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm sorry. I had lain there and not answered him, not because I had nothing to say, but because there are moments when the right response is to let something exist in the air without immediately reaching for it. And that had been one of those moments. If I had opened the door and said, "Come in," we would have had a conversation that neither of us was ready for, raw, disordered, running on no sleep and too much adrenaline, the kind of conversation that feels like progress in the dark and looks like wreckage in the morning. I had made enough of those kinds of mistakes in my life to know when to wait. So I waited. I made tea on the little electric kettle. I washed my face at the small utility sink in the corner that I had claimed as mine out of necessity. I put on real clothes, a navy blouse, gray slacks, the pearl earrings Gerald had given me for our 25th anniversary, which I had taken to wearing every day down here, because they were mine, and I refused to let this basement reduce me to the version of myself that didn't bother. And then I sat in the armchair I'd wedged into the corner, a small upholstered one I'd brought from my own house. The one thing in this basement that belonged to me completely, and I waited for the house to wake up. Ethan came downstairs at 7:15. He was still in the clothes from the night before. His tie was gone and his shirt was untucked, and he looked like a man who had not slept, which meant we had that much in common. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me across the basement with an expression that had none of his usual management in it. No brightness, no deflection, nothing calculated. Just a face. His face, which was his father's face, which still had the power to do something complicated to me even now. "Can I come in?" he asked. It was such a strange question given that it was his house. I understood, I think, that he was asking something different, something that had nothing to do with the square footage of the basement. "Sit down," I said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the cot, the narrow child's bed they had moved me to, and he put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a moment and stayed like that. I let him. I sipped my tea, and I let him exist in whatever he was moving through, because I had waited this long and I could wait a few more minutes. When he lifted his head, his eyes were red at the rims. Not from crying, I thought, from not sleeping, and from the particular physical toll of sitting with something you can't unfeel. "I keep trying to figure out when it started," he said, "how we got here. And I can't land on one moment. It was a lot of small things. Vanessa was stressed about the boutique. I was stressed about money. And at some point, I stopped pushing back on things I should have pushed back on." I looked at him. "That's true," I said. "And it's also not the whole truth." He nodded slowly. He didn't argue, which surprised me slightly. "You knew the bathroom reassignment was wrong," I said. "You knew the guest room situation was wrong. You stood in the garage when I came to talk to you, and you told me to give it time. You watched it happen, and you chose, every single time, to look somewhere else." "Yes," he said. "That's not just going along with someone. That's a choice, I know," he said. "I know it is." We were quiet for a moment. The furnace kicked on with its familiar throat-clearing sound, and I thought, not for the first time, that I was going to hear that sound in my sleep for years. "Did you know?" I asked. "About the attorney. About what Vanessa was planning to do with my estate." He was quiet for long enough that the answer was clear, even before he gave it. "I knew she was thinking about it," he said. "I told myself it wasn't, that it was theoretical, that it was just her trying to problem-solve the money situation." He paused. "I kept telling myself it hadn't become a real plan yet. It had a specific attorney picked out," I said. "I know," he said it very quietly. "I know, Ethan." I set down my tea. "Look at me." He did. "Did you love me?" I said. "Or did you love the idea of what you thought you might eventually be able to access?" The question sat between us like something physical. I had not planned to ask it in those words. It came out of me the way the truest things often do, unmediated, blunt, the question underneath all the other questions. He flinched. Not dramatically, a small contraction around his eyes and mouth, the expression of someone who has been touched somewhere they didn't expect. "I love you," he said. "Mom, I love you. That's not that two things coexisted and I let the wrong one drive and I—" He stopped, pressed his hands together. "I can see how that looks from where you're sitting. I can see that the answer sounds like nothing right now." "It doesn't sound like nothing," I said. "It sounds like something I can't verify, which is different." He nodded. "Here is what I need you to understand," I said. "Not for an argument. Not to make you feel worse than you already do. I need you to understand it because it's the truth. And the truth is what we're doing now." I folded my hands in my lap, the way I used to when I was talking to him as a boy and needed him to pay attention. "I came here because you asked me to. I left my house, my routines, my independence, because my son said he wanted his mother nearby. And within days I was being managed. The bathroom, the kitchen, the guest room. Each individual thing could be explained away. But all of them together were a system, Ethan. And a system has intent behind it." He didn't say anything. "I don't think you designed it," I said. "I think Vanessa designed most of it, and you went along because it was easier than the conversation you'd have to have with her, if you didn't." And I think that decision, the decision to not have the hard conversation with your wife so that you didn't have to defend your mother, I think that's the thing I'm going to have the hardest time with, not the basement. The basement is a room. What I can't easily forgive is being left alone in it by choice. He put his face back in his hands. His shoulders moved once, a short, sharp movement. I don't know what I can say, he said from behind his hands. I don't know what there is. Right now, nothing, I said. Right now, I need you to hear me and not try to fix it in the next 10 minutes, because it can't be fixed in the next 10 minutes. That's not how this works. He lifted his head. His face was a mess, the red eyes, the lines of a sleepless night, something younger and more unguarded than I'd seen from him in years. What do you need from me? Right now, practically. What do you need? I need to leave this house, I said. I've needed that for a while. I have a call with my attorney on Monday, and I'll be reaching out to a real estate contact about a rental. I'll be out within 2 weeks. Something moved across his face, relief and shame in the same wave, which was honest enough that I gave him credit for not trying to conceal it. Where will you go? Somewhere that has a proper bathroom, I said. And despite everything, despite the weeks in this basement, despite the anger and the grief and the exhaustion, something almost like a smile moved through me when I said it. Not a happy smile, but a real one. Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and then immediately looked like he didn't think he was allowed to have laughed, and I understood that too. Mom, he said, I really am sorry. I know that's... I heard you last night, I said, through the door. I heard you. He went still. I didn't answer because I wasn't ready, I said. But I heard you. And I believe you mean it. That doesn't resolve anything. But I believe you mean it. He nodded once. He looked like a man who had been expecting a much harder landing and had not yet fully understood that the ground was still coming. I let the conversation be what it was and didn't try to extend it further. We were not going to fix 20 years of gradual distance in a Sunday morning conversation in a basement. We were not going to resolve the question of who Ethan had allowed himself to become under the influence of his financial anxiety and his wife's particular brand of ambition. Those were longer reckonings. And they required more than one morning and more than one conversation. And I had enough clarity, after everything, to know that demanding resolution on my schedule was its own kind of error. I told him to go get some rest. He went upstairs. I heard his footsteps move through the kitchen, pause, then continue toward the bedroom. I sat in this armchair for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my daughter Claire. She answered on the second ring, which was typical. Claire had always been the one who picked up. Mom, it's early. I know, I said. I need to talk to you. I told her everything. Not the version I had been carefully editing in the weekly check-in calls we'd had since I moved in the fine. Everything's fine. The house is nice. Ethan and Vanessa have been welcoming version. The real version. All of it, from the bathroom to the guest room to the basement to the dinner party and the documents and Ethan at the door in the early morning hours. Claire was quiet through most of it. That was her way. She listened fully before she responded, which had always been one of her best qualities, and occasionally one of the most unnerving, because you couldn't calibrate what she was thinking until she was ready to tell you. When I finished, she was quiet for another 5 seconds. Then she said, Mom, why didn't you call me? I was managing it. You were in a basement. I was managing it from the basement. A long exhale. Mom. I know, I said. I know, but I needed to understand it fully before I stopped. Tried again. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I involved anyone else. And I needed to handle it myself. I needed that. She was quiet again. And then quietly, are you okay? I thought about that question carefully, which is the only way I know how to answer it. I'm intact, I said. I'm tired and I'm sad and I'm angry in ways that I think are going to take a while to sort through. But I'm intact. That's not the same as okay. No, I agreed. It's not. I'm coming, she said. Claire, I'm coming Thursday. Don't argue with me. I'll stay through the weekend and help you find a place. Her voice had taken on the particular tone she'd inherited from me, the one that meant the decision was made and the conversation about the decision was over. And Mom, I'm angry. I want you to know that. I am genuinely, thoroughly angry on your behalf. I know, I said, and I was grateful for it. Not because anger solved anything, but because being angry on someone's behalf is a form of love, and I had been running low on evidence of love for a while. We talked for another 20 minutes. By the time I hung up, something in the room felt lighter. Not the situation was exactly as it had been, but something inside it. The rest of that Sunday moved slowly. Vanessa did not come downstairs, which was, I thought, probably the right decision on her part. Whatever she was processing after the dinner, and I had some sense of it, from the tone of her voice I could hear through the ceiling during the muffled conversation she and Ethan had in the kitchen mid-morning, mostly her voice, controlled but with an edge that suggested considerable internal pressure. She kept it upstairs and out of my way. I was not certain whether this was respect or strategy. With Vanessa, those two things had always been difficult to separate. My attorney, a man named Richard Holloway, whom I had worked with for 9 years, and who had the useful quality of being entirely unbothered by complexity, had asked me to email him a summary before our Monday call. I sat at the folding table that afternoon and wrote it factual, organized, walking through the timeline and the relevant documents and what I needed addressed. As I wrote it, the whole sequence laid out in clean sequential sentences. I was struck by how clear it was, how unambiguous. There was no version of these events that reflected well on the choices that had been made in this house. Writing it down didn't make me feel powerful, exactly. It made me feel sad in the way that clarity sometimes brings sadness when you see something completely and realize there is no interpretation that changes it. I sent the email at 4:30 in the afternoon. At 5, Vanessa knocked on the basement door. I had not expected this. I had expected her to wait to let Ethan manage the immediate aftermath, to hold her position, to approach me only when she had determined the most advantageous angle of approach. What I had not expected was for her to knock on Sunday evening and say, through the door, "Marjorie, can I come down?" I considered that for a moment. Then I said yes. She came down the stairs in a cashmere sweater and dark jeans, her hair pulled back. No jewelry, none of the usual presentation she wore like armor. She looked, and I say this not with satisfaction, but with a kind of exhausted accuracy, she looked like a person who had spent a day sitting with something too heavy to hold comfortably. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the basement, at the folding table and the plastic crate and the narrow cot and the furnace and the small kettle and the armchair and the boxes. She looked at all of it in a way that suggested she was really seeing it perhaps for the first time, as something other than a practical solution to a spatial problem. "I didn't come to make an argument," she said. "All right," I said. I came because she stopped, pressed her lips together. "I came because I want to tell you something, and I need to say it without Ethan here, because if he's here, I'll keep looking at him and adjusting what I say based on his reaction, and I can't do that right now." That surprised me enough that I just waited. "The boutique," she said. "I've been terrified about the boutique for 2 years. We overextended inventory, the renovation we did last spring, a hiring decision that turned out badly. And I've been holding it together with the wrong things. Making decisions I wouldn't have made if I weren't scared." She paused. "That doesn't explain away anything." "I'm not saying it does. I'm saying it's the context that I've been living in. I understand financial fear," I said. "That's not the part I'm having trouble with." "I know." She looked at the floor, the attorney conversation. "What you heard me say at dinner." "Yes. I had convinced myself it was practical planning," she said. That it was just responsible to think ahead. That it would benefit you too, to have things organized. That's what I told myself. Enough times that I started to believe it. "Did you?" She met my eyes. And for the first time since I had known her 9 years, 9 years of polished surfaces and careful management, and the particular social grace of a woman who had decided early that the best defense was an impeccable presentation. For the first time, I saw something unguarded in her face. "No," she said, "not really." "We sat with that, Vanessa," I said. "I have a question, and I want an honest answer." She nodded. "Did you think about me at all?" "Not as a financial variable. As a person." "Did you think about what this was like for me?" Quiet for a long time. The furnace hummed. "I told myself you were fine," she said finally. "I told myself you were adjusting, that the basement was temporary, that you were resilient." Another pause. "I didn't let myself think too carefully about what you were actually feeling, because if I did, I'd have had to stop. And you didn't want to stop." "No," she said. "I didn't want to stop." It was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said to me, and I did not know what to do with it, whether to be grateful for the honesty or to simply hold it as information. "Both," I decided. "Both at once. I'm leaving," I said. "I'm moving out within 2 weeks." My daughter is coming Thursday to help me find a place. Vanessa nodded. She did not argue. She did not perform surprise. The lease on the boutique, I said. I'm not going to make any decisions about it today. I have 8 months to decide, and I'm going to take the time I need to think clearly. But I want you to understand that whatever I decide, I'll decide it on the terms of what is legally and financially appropriate, not out of spite and not out of charity. Just correctly. She nodded again. Something in her shoulders released slightly. Not relief exactly, but the release of a tension that had been held too long. That's fair, she said. It's what I have to offer right now, I said. It's all I have. She went back upstairs. I heard her steps, and then the sound of the kitchen, and then Ethan's voice asking something I couldn't make out, and Vanessa answering, also inaudible, and then quiet. Monday came. Richard Holloway called at 10 o'clock as arranged, and I sat at the folding table in the basement of my son's house and walked my attorney through the situation with the same organized clarity I had used in the email. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I paid him for. When I finished, he asked 3 focused questions about the estate documentation, the property structure, and the timeline I was working with. Then he said, Marjorie, your position is strong. You have full ownership and control of all assets. There is no legal mechanism by which anyone can access your estate without your documented consent. What you need to focus on now is reorganizing the documents to ensure that your wishes are clearly recorded and that the current beneficiary arrangements reflect what you actually want, not assumptions that were made in a different context. I want to remove Ethan from any formal positions of authority in the estate, I said. Not permanently, necessarily. But for now, that's straightforward. We can do that. I also want to revisit my will. The structure was set up before any of this, and it reflects a version of this family that I'm not certain is still accurate. Also straightforward, a brief pause. Do you want to disinherit him? I thought about that word. Disinherit. The weight of it, the finality. No, I said, not disinherit. I want to restructure. I want any future inheritance to be conditional on demonstrated relationship, not assumed on the basis of biology alone. I want a structure that reflects that I can see and evaluate what's in front of me, not one that rewards people in advance for love they haven't shown. Richard was quiet for a moment. That's a more nuanced framework than most estate plans, he said. But it's achievable. I'll have a draft to you within the week. Good, I said. We wrapped up the call. I sat for a moment after hanging up in the humming basement with the Monday morning light coming through the small rectangle of window, and I allowed myself to feel what I felt without immediately processing it. It was not triumph. It was not relief, not exactly. It was something harder to name, the feeling of having moved through something and arrived somewhere, not whole and not unscathed, but arrived. Claire arrived Thursday evening as promised. She came straight from the airport in a rental car, with a rolling suitcase and the focused energy of someone who had been planning logistics for 4 days and was ready to execute. She stood at the front door of Ethan's house and rang the bell, and Ethan answered it, and they looked at each other for a moment in the specific way of siblings who have not spoken about a thing yet, but both know what the thing is. Hey, she said. She came downstairs to the basement before she did anything else. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the room, the folding table, the cot, the furnace, all of it, and her face did something that she worked to control and mostly succeeded. She sat down in the armchair across from me and reached over and took my hand and held it for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, okay, let's get you out of here. We spent Friday looking at apartments. 3 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, each of them better in some ways and worse in others in the specific way of rental apartments that require you to imagine yourself living in them and figure out if you can. The third one in the morning was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in the Ellery district, which was the historic neighborhood in this city that I had driven through 100 times and always found myself thinking, I could live here. Original hardwood floors, windows that faced southwest, high ceilings, a kitchen with actual counter space, and a bathroom that did not have paint cans on the shelf. The building was solid and quiet. The property manager, a practical woman named Dina, who had been running the building for 16 years, told me the previous tenant had stayed for 11 years, which is the kind of information that tells you something about a place. Claire walked through the apartment with her hands in her pockets and her eyes moving across every surface, the way she approached everything methodically, without rushing to an opinion. At the end, she came to stand next to me by the southwest windows, where the afternoon light was coming in at exactly the angle I had hoped it would. And she said, "This is the one." "Yes," I said, "it is. I signed the lease on Saturday morning. I paid first and last month's rent and the security deposit from my own account, with my own pen, and I drove away from that rental office, feeling something I had not felt since I had arrived at Ethan's house 6 weeks earlier, like I was moving towards something rather than away from it. The moving out from Ethan's house took most of Saturday afternoon. It did not take long, because I had arrived with what I could fit in my car in a few boxes, and I had not accumulated anything in the basement that I wanted to keep. Ethan carried boxes. He carried them without being asked, without commentary, and he did it carefully, which I appreciated. Claire coordinated with the efficiency of someone who has organized 3 school moves and 2 office relocations in the last decade and finds logistics genuinely satisfying. Vanessa did not come out of the bedroom while we packed. The door was closed. I did not go to knock on it, and she did not come to find me. That was, I thought, probably the right choice for both of us. There were things that needed to be said between Vanessa and me, but none of them were Saturday afternoon things. They were later things, perhaps much later. When the last box was in Claire's rental car and mine, I stood in the living room of Ethan's house, for a moment not the basement, the living room, because I was not going to exit through the basement door, and looked around at the space. The coordinated throw pillows, the tasteful art, the carefully managed surfaces of a life that had been assembled to look a certain way. Ethan was standing near the door. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in days, which was accurate. He looked like a man who had been sitting with something uncomfortable, and was not finished sitting with it, which was also accurate, and which was, in some ways, the most encouraging thing I had seen from him in weeks. "I'll call you," I said. "Okay," he said, "not right away. I need some time, I know, but I'll call." He nodded. His jaw worked for a moment the way it had since he was a boy, when he was trying not to say more than was asked of him. "I'm going to." He stopped. "I want to be better. I know that's just words right now." "It is just right now," I said. "You're right about that. But words are where it starts." I walked out the front door into the late afternoon. Claire was already at the car. The air was cool and carried the smell of early spring, that particular raw, alive scent of ground that has been frozen and is beginning to open. I stood on the driveway for just a moment and breathed it in. I did not look back at the house. I had spent 6 weeks being invisible in that place, and I was not going to give it my backwards gaze as well. I had my papers and my armchair and my pearl earrings and the lease for a 4th-floor apartment with southwest-facing windows, and that was enough. We drove to the new apartment. Dina, the property manager, had left a key in the lockbox as arranged. I opened the door, and the afternoon light was doing exactly what it had done when we visited, falling across the hardwood floors at that long slant that turns ordinary wood into something that looks almost warm. I walked through the empty rooms slowly, with Claire behind me, and I stopped in the kitchen and stood there for a moment, not thinking anything in particular. Just standing in a kitchen that was mine, that had no rules about when I was allowed to use it, that did not belong to someone who was deciding by degrees how much space I was permitted to occupy. "You okay?" Claire asked from the doorway. I turned around and looked at my daughter, this woman who had picked up on the second ring, who had been on a plane within the week, who was standing in my new kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was trying to read me. "I will be," I said. She nodded. She accepted that, because she knew me well enough to know it was the truest answer I had. We unloaded the boxes that evening. We ordered food from somewhere and ate it on the floor, because there was no furniture yet, and we talked about logistics and about nothing in particular, and occasionally about the actual thing, which was harder to talk about, and which we approached carefully, the way you approach something that is still a little raw. At one point, Claire said quietly, "Around a bite of food, I keep thinking about you in that basement. I keep thinking about how long you were there." 6 weeks, I said. 6 weeks, she shook her head. "Mom, you should have called me." "I know," I said. I've said I know. "I would have come immediately. That's why I didn't call," I said. "I needed to understand it myself first. I needed to know what I was dealing with before anyone else arrived, with their anger and their opinions, because I needed mine to be the first ones. She was quiet for a moment. Then that is so completely you. I know. She reached over and put her hand on my arm briefly, the way she had done when she was small and needed to make a point through contact rather than words, and I felt the warmth of it move through me and thought, this is the thing. Not the papers, not the lease, not the estate reorganization. This a daughter who drove 2,000 miles because I needed her to. This is the thing they were never going to take from me, because they had never understood that it existed. Late that night, after Claire had gone to sleep on the air mattress in the second bedroom, I sat alone in the living room of my new apartment in the Ellery district, in the dark, with the city sounds coming through the window and the light from the street making soft shapes on the ceiling. I was tired in a way that went all the way down to somewhere I didn't have a name for. Not the tired of one bad night or one bad week. The tired of having been reduced and then rebuilt, of having spent 6 weeks defending the perimeter of yourself against people who should never have made you do that. But I was here, in a room I had chosen, with a key that was mine, and somewhere below the exhaustion, steadier and quieter and more durable than anything I had felt in the basement of Ethan's house, was the beginning of something that felt, if I held very still, almost like peace. Not peace yet, not complete. Not without the grief of what had happened and the uncertainty of what came next, the lease question and the estate revision and the long, uncharted work of figuring out what Ethan and I were to each other now. But the beginning of it. And for that night, in that room, in the dark, the beginning was enough. The first morning in the new apartment, I woke before dawn and didn't know where I was. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. There is a particular disorientation that comes from waking in an unfamiliar space, the few seconds where your mind is reaching for context and finding none, where you are purely yourself without location, without story, without the accumulated weight of everything that has brought you to this particular ceiling in this particular darkness. For those few seconds, I was nobody's mother and nobody's tenant and nobody's problem. I was just a woman waking up. Then it came back. The apartment. The Ellery district. The southwest windows. The boxes stacked against the wall that still needed to be unpacked. Claire, asleep in the other room on an air mattress that had been losing pressure since midnight, which she had refused to admit because she didn't want me to feel guilty about the accommodations. I lay there for a moment and let the pieces reassemble themselves. And then, and this is the thing I want to tell you, because it surprised me what I felt was not grief, and not relief exactly, and not the complicated, exhausted sadness that had been my primary companion for 6 weeks in a basement. What I felt in the early dark of that first morning was something quieter and more fundamental than any of those things. I felt like myself, not perfectly, not without the damage of what had happened sitting somewhere in my chest like a weight I was going to be carrying for a while, but recognizably, specifically, undeniably myself, Marjorie Bennett, 72 years old, widow of Gerald, mother of Ethan and Claire, owner of 4 properties and a very good armchair, a woman who had been put in a basement and had walked back out of it on her own terms. That was mine. They couldn't take that back. I got up and made tea and stood at the southwest windows while the city lightened outside, and I watched the day begin, and I let myself have that morning without rushing it toward anything. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were mine, which made the difficulty bearable in a way that the easy wrongness of Ethan's house never had been. Furniture arrived, some from storage, some new, chosen by me in the specific way of someone who has been reminded that their preferences matter. The apartment took shape around me gradually, the way spaces do when they're becoming homes rather than temporary arrangements, acquiring the particular texture of a life actually being lived in them. Books on shelves. The photographs Gerald and I had taken on our trip to the coast the summer before he got sick, framed and hung on the wall where I could see them from the kitchen. The armchair from the basement, my armchair, the one I'd wedged into the corner, down there positioned by the window where the afternoon light hit it exactly right. I had not realized, until I began to put my things back in order, how much of myself I had packed away in those boxes. Claire stayed through the following Wednesday. She helped me unpack, accompanied me to 2 furniture stores, cooked dinner in the new kitchen on 3 consecutive evenings, and generally made her presence felt in the way of someone who loves you and is also slightly furious on your behalf and is managing both things simultaneously. On her last evening, we sat at the small dining table I'd found at a consignment store, solid oak, slightly nicked on one corner, exactly right, and ate pasta she'd made, and talked about everything and nothing for 2 hours the way we hadn't since Gerald died. At some point, she said, "What are you going to do about the boutique?" I had been waiting for her to ask. She had waited a long time to ask, which I appreciated. "I've been thinking about it," I said. "I haven't decided. You could end the lease when it's up." I could. "You could renew it at a significantly higher rate." "I could do that too. Or you could." She paused, turning her fork. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just want to make sure you know all your options." "I know all my options," I said. "That's the problem. When you know all your options, you have to actually choose one, instead of letting the situation choose for you." She nodded. "What does your gut say?" I thought about Vanessa standing at the bottom of the basement stairs in her cashmere sweater, saying, "I didn't let myself think too carefully about what you were actually feeling, because if I did, I'd have had to stop." I thought about how that sentence had moved through me when she said it, the strange, complicated feeling of being genuinely told the truth by someone who had spent months being something less than honest. "My gut says that Vanessa is not a simple person," I said, "and that simple decisions about complex people tend to produce consequences that are also more complex than you planned for." Claire looked at me for a moment. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you haven't decided." "Yes," I agreed. "It is," she laughed, and I laughed. And it was, in its small way, its ordinary way, one of the better moments I'd had in a long time. She flew home the next morning. I drove her to the airport and hugged her in the departure lane for longer than either of us had done in years. The way you sometimes return to physical expressions of love that you'd let become abbreviated by time and distance and the assumption of permanence. She pulled back and looked at me. "Call me," she said. "Actually call me, not the edited version." "I will," I said. "Promise." "I promise." She went through the doors. I drove back to the Ellery district and went upstairs and stood in my apartment in the morning, quiet, and I began, in earnest, the process of figuring out what came next. The call from Ethan came 3 weeks after I moved out. Not a text, a call, which felt significant in a way I didn't want to overinterpret, but couldn't entirely ignore. He called on a Tuesday evening, and I sat in the armchair by the window and let it ring once before I answered. "Mom," he said. "Ethan." A pause. The particular quality of silence that happens when someone has rehearsed something and is now deciding whether to say the rehearsed version or something closer to the real one. "How's the apartment?" he said. "It's good," I said. "It's very good, actually. I'm glad." Another pause. "I drove past the Ellery district last week. It's a nice neighborhood." "I've always thought so, Mom." The rehearsed version abandoned. I could hear it in the shift of his voice, something falling away, leaving the real thing underneath. "I've been seeing someone. A therapist. I started 2 weeks ago." I was quiet for a moment. "I'm not telling you because I want credit," he said quickly. I'm not trying to make it about me showing you I've changed, because I know it's been 3 weeks and that's not how it works. I'm telling you because I wanted to be honest with you about what I'm doing. Because I think honesty is the only thing I have to offer you right now." "What are you working on?" I asked. "In therapy." He exhaled. "Why I didn't protect you. Why it was easier to keep the peace with Vanessa than to say the thing I should have said at the garage door. When you first came to me. Why I told myself that going along wasn't the same as participating." A brief pause. "There's more, but that's the main thing." I looked at the window. The evening light was doing something soft and complicated to the building across the street. "That's the main thing," I agreed. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything specific. I wanted you to know that I know what I did. Not just got caught. I know what I did. There's a difference." He was right that there is a difference. I had thought about it often in those 3 weeks, the distinction between the shame of exposure and the shame of actual sounding and the shame of actual understanding between a person who is sorry they were seen and a person who is sorry they did the thing. I had not known, after the dinner party, after the basement door, which version I was dealing with. I was still not entirely certain. But what he was saying had the texture of the real thing, and I had been listening to Ethan's voice for 44 years, and I thought I could still tell the difference. "I'll call you next week," I said. "We can have lunch." The exhale on the other end was so full of relief that it almost hurt to hear. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. Somewhere with good food, I said. I'm not eating at a folding table anymore. A short sound, almost a laugh, real and broken around the edges, the kind that happens when something is funny and painful at the same time. Wherever you want, Mom. Wherever you want. We had lunch 11 days later at a small Italian place in the neighborhood I'd always liked, the kind of restaurant with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus and food that takes its time. We sat across from each other and talked for 2 hours, and it was not easy, and it was not resolved, and there were moments when the weight of everything that had happened sat heavily between us and made the conversation feel like it was happening at some distance from the two people we actually were to each other. But there were also other moments. A story he told about something that had gone wrong at work that week that was genuinely funny, and I laughed at it, and he looked at me. When I laughed with an expression, I recognized the expression of a child who has done something to please their parent and feels the specific warmth of that. It was small. It was real. It was not nothing. Afterward, we stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant in the thin spring sunshine, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." The building Vanessa's lease. He looked at the sidewalk briefly, then back at me. "I'm not asking you to go easy on her. I'm not asking you to do anything specific. I want to know where you're at with it, if you're willing to say." "I've made a decision," I said. He waited. "I'm not renewing her lease," I said. "Not because I'm punishing her. The unit has been underperforming as a commercial space for the last 18 months, and I've had interest from another tenant who wants to take the full ground floor as a medical practice, which would serve the building better financially and serve the neighborhood better practically." I paused. "It's a business decision. That's all it is." He nodded slowly. "Does Vanessa know?" "She will," I said. "Richard is preparing the formal notice. She'll have the full 90 days required by the lease, and I'm having him include a referral to 2 commercial real estate agents who specialize in the type of retail space she needs. It's not generous, but it's correct." He was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be Ethan," I said gently. "How Vanessa responds to the consequences of what she put in motion is between Vanessa and Vanessa. I made the decision that is legally appropriate and financially sound. What I did not do was make it cruel, and I did not make it personal, even though I would have had every right to." I looked at him. "What I'm not going to do is keep making my business decisions around what's convenient for people who put me in a basement." He held my gaze, and then he said, "You're right, I'm sorry I asked." "Don't be sorry you asked," I said. "Just understand the answer." We said goodbye on the sidewalk, and I drove back to the Ellery district with the windows down and the spring air coming in, and I felt something settle in me, not triumphant, not vindicated, just settled, like a thing that had been slightly off-center, finding its correct position. The formal notice went to Vanessa 4 days later. She called me that same evening. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. "You could have told me yourself," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not quite anger, more like the sound of a person who has been bracing for a blow and has now received it and is trying to decide how to absorb it with dignity. "I could have," I said. "I chose to do it through the proper legal channel because that's the appropriate way to handle a lease termination." "Marjorie," a pause. "I know I don't have the standing to ask you for anything." "You don't," I said. "I know." Another pause longer. "I just want you to know I've been thinking about what you said. In the basement. When you asked me if I'd thought about what it was like for you." I waited. "I think about it a lot," she said. "I think about the bathroom, the guest room, the dinner," what I said to Darlene. A short, controlled exhale. "I'm not a person who typically does a lot of self-examination. I grew up in a family where you solved problems and moved forward and didn't dwell. And I think I turned you into a problem to be solved. And you weren't a problem. You were a person." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Marjorie. I know it doesn't fix the lease. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I wanted to say it to you directly." I sat in my armchair by the window for a long moment. Here is the honest truth about what I felt in that moment. Because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would not make it tidy, I felt the apology land. I felt it as real. Vanessa was not a warm person she had never been, and I doubted she would suddenly become one, but she was not, I believed, a person who apologized for strategic purposes. She said difficult things directly, when she chose to say them at all, which was rare, which meant that when she chose to say them, they meant something. And I also felt simultaneously that an apology was not repair. That words spoken down a phone line 90 days before a lease expiration were not the same thing as years of honesty and consideration. Both things were true. I held both. I hear you, I said. Thank you for saying it. That's all, she said. That's all I have right now, I said. Maybe that changes. I don't know yet. She accepted that. The call ended. I sat for a while in the evening quiet of my apartment, and then I got up and watered the plants on the windowsills I had bought, 3 small ones at a market 2 weeks earlier, just to have something living in the space that needed tending. And I made dinner, and I ate it at my oak table with the nicked corner, and I thought about the distance between who people are and who they're capable of becoming, and whether those two things ever actually close. I did not have an answer. I'm not sure anyone does. The months that followed moved at the pace of a life actually being lived, which is different from the pace of a crisis. A crisis has a terrible momentum. It pulls you forward, whether you want to go or not. Events generating events, each day defined by whatever the situation requires of you. A life, when it belongs to you again, moves differently. It has room in it. It has mornings that don't demand anything specific, and afternoons that go in directions you didn't plan, and small pleasures that are only pleasures and nothing else. I joined a community garden 3 blocks from the apartment, which was something I had been telling myself I would do since Gerald died and had never quite managed. I went on a Tuesday morning in late April and introduced myself to a woman named Harriet, who had been tending the same plot for 12 years and who regarded me with the particular frankness of someone who has no patience for small talk and a great deal of patience for actual conversation. We became, in the specific way of 2 older women who recognize each other's quality friends. Not immediate close friends that takes longer when you're our age, and rightly so, but real ones. The kind where you can sit together in a garden on a weekday morning without either of you needing to perform anything. I attended a seminar in May on estate planning for seniors, hosted by a local nonprofit. Not because I needed the information I had, Richard, for that, and Paulette, but because I wanted to understand what other people in my situation were being told, and whether they were being told the right things. They mostly were not. The presenter was well-meaning but vague in exactly the ways that leave older adults vulnerable, talking about trusting family members, deferring to people who love you, not being a burden, and I sat in the 3rd row and felt the particular irritation of someone who has been on the other side of those platitudes. Afterward, during the question period, I raised my hand and said, I want to offer something, if that's all right. I'm 72, and I recently went through a situation where I did not have my financial affairs clearly documented and clearly protected, and I allowed people I trusted to convince me that relying on them was the same thing as being cared for. It wasn't. Those are 2 very different things. I paused. I would encourage anyone here who hasn't consulted an independent attorney, not a family member's attorney, an independent one, to do so before they make any decisions about their estate or their housing arrangements. That independence saved me from a situation that I would otherwise have had very little recourse from. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman in the 2nd row, I would estimate her, at around 68, silver-haired, with the posture of someone carrying a question she hadn't yet decided how to phrase, raised her hand partway and said, "What kind of situation, if you don't mind my asking?" And I told her. Not all of it, not the details, but the shape of it, the move, the basement, the plan she had overheard, the documents on the dinner table. I told it in 5 minutes, plainly, without drama, because the truth doesn't require embellishment when it's sufficiently clear. The room was very quiet when I finished. The woman in the 2nd row said, "My son has been asking me to move in with him." "That may be wonderful," I said. "It may be exactly what you both need. I am not telling you not to trust your family. I'm telling you to trust your family and have a good attorney and know what you own. Those 2 things are not in conflict unless someone is asking you to choose between them." She nodded slowly. I didn't know what she did with that information. I hoped she used it. What I did know was that something had shifted in me as I said it out loud in that room full of strangers, something that had been looking for a shape to become. The experience I had moved through was not something I intended to keep only to myself. Not in a crusading way, not with a mission. because I am 72 years old, and I have lived long enough to be suspicious of people who turn their personal suffering into platforms. Quietly, in the rooms and conversations where it could be useful, I intended to say the true thing. Because the true thing was that older adults are not obligated to be grateful for the bare minimum of consideration. That a roof over your head provided by someone who has calculated your worth is not the same as love. That your name on a document is not a formality, it is a protection, and it is yours, and nobody who actually loves you should want you to give it up. The nonprofit that hosted the seminar asked me, 3 weeks later, whether I would be willing to participate in a peer support group they were developing for older adults navigating housing transitions. I said I would think about it. Then I thought about it for 4 days and called them back and said yes. I want to tell you about the anniversary dinner. Not because it was the most dramatic thing that happened. In the months after I left the basement, it wasn't, but because it was the truest ending to all of it. In the way that endings are rarely dramatic and almost always quiet. It was late October, almost exactly 8 months since the dinner party where I had walked upstairs with a folder and placed documents on a white tablecloth in a room full of people who were supposed to be my family. 8 months since Ethan had knocked on the basement door before dawn and said I'm sorry through the wood. 8 months of calls and lunches and the slow, imperfect work of two people who love each other trying to find out who they are to each other now. It had not been linear. I want to be honest about that. There had been a dinner in July that ended badly, not dramatically. No raised voices. Just the kind of bad where something goes wrong in the register between you and you can both feel it and neither of you can find the thread back to solid ground, and you go home afterward feeling further apart than when you sat down. There had been a phone call in August where Ethan said something that was supposed to be an explanation and landed as an excuse, and I told him plainly that I heard the difference. And there was a silence on the line that went on long enough that I wasn't certain the call was still connected. There had been setbacks and recalibrations and moments where I questioned whether I was asking for too much or not asking for enough. Whether the lunch every 3 weeks was progress or just a ritual substituting for progress. And through all of it, Ethan had kept showing up. That was the thing. He kept calling and kept suggesting lunch and kept coming. And he brought no lawyers and no paperwork and no requests. And he asked about my garden and my neighbor Harriet and the peer support group. And he listened when I told him about those things, in the specific way of someone who is actually interested rather than strategically attentive. It was not perfection. He stumbled. He overcorrected sometimes, too eager to demonstrate changed behavior in ways that called attention to the demonstration rather than the change. But he kept showing up. A person who keeps showing up imperfectly, without the expectation of immediate reward, is telling you something. I have lived long enough to know that. The dinner was my idea. A Sunday evening in late October at the apartment. I invited 5 people, Claire and her husband, who had flown in for the weekend, Harriet from the garden, a woman named Joan from the peer support group, who had become someone I considered a genuine friend, and Ethan, not Vanessa. I want to address that directly, because it requires honesty. Vanessa had vacated the boutique space in September, within her 90-day notice period, and had relocated to a smaller space in another neighborhood with the help of the commercial real estate referral I had included in the notice letter. I had heard, through Ethan, that the smaller space was actually better suited to the boutique's current scale, lower overhead, a neighborhood with more foot traffic, room to rebuild rather than maintain. I don't know if that information was offered to reassure me or simply as honest reporting. Either way, I received it as information. Vanessa and I had not spoken since the phone call in the spring. We were not in a place where a dinner invitation was something either of us would have found comfortable, and I was not going to force a reconciliation for the sake of appearances. That particular reckoning, if it ever came, would come in its own time and on its own terms. I had learned enough about myself in the past 8 months to know that I could not manufacture forgiveness on a schedule. It came when it came, if it came, and pretending otherwise helped nobody. Ethan had asked me, when I called to invite him, whether he should bring Vanessa. I had said not yet. He had said okay without argument, which was itself a kind of answer to a question I hadn't quite asked. I cooked. A real dinner, the kind I used to make when Gerald was alive. And we had people over on Sunday evenings roast chicken, roasted vegetables, good bread, a decent bottle of wine that Harriet brought, and a better one that Claire's husband selected, with the focused deliberation of a man who takes wine seriously and knows it's slightly ridiculous. We sat around my oak table with the nicked corner, all six of us, which was a little crowded, which was exactly right, and talked and ate and laughed at things that were actually funny. At some point during dinner, Ethan said something at the table. He had been talking to Claire about something I had been half listening while also talking to Harriet about the spring garden planning, and I heard him stop mid-sentence and say, more quietly, apparently to no one in particular, but also clearly to me, I drove past the old house last week, the one you and Dad had. The table shifted, not uncomfortably, but perceptibly, the specific attentiveness that happens when a conversation moves to a register that matters. The maple tree in front, he said. It's still there. It's enormous now. I set down my fork. I know, I said. I drove past it the week I moved out of your house. I sat in the car and looked at it for a while. He looked at me. Why didn't you ever go back? After Dad died, I always thought you'd want to keep it. It was too big for one person, I said. Too much quiet in it. I thought I'd stay, but the quiet was different without him. I paused. Your father used to say that a house is just a shell, that what makes it a home is the specific people in it on a specific afternoon. He was right about that. Something moved across Ethan's face. I had seen it before. This particular expression, the one where Gerald's features were doing something that Gerald used to do, when something had gotten through to him in a way he wasn't going to talk about directly. I should have done better, he said. It was quiet enough that only the people immediately around us heard it clearly. Not a speech, not a performance, just a statement, plain and direct, offered to the table and to me. Yes, I said. You should have. I'm working on it. I know, I said. I can see that. The table settled back into its noise, Claire's husband refilling glasses, Harriet asking Joan something about her grandchildren, the particular warm chaos of a room full of people who are at ease with each other. And I sat at the head of my table, in the apartment I had chosen, surrounded by people who were here because I wanted them here, and I thought about what it had taken to arrive at this particular Sunday evening in October. I had been put in a basement. I had lain on a child's mattress and listened to a furnace and watched a rectangle of gray sky from a window that showed me nothing. I had been managed and maneuvered and reduced by degrees to something that was supposed to be too diminished to resist. And I had resisted anyway, not because I am exceptional, not because I had some reserve of strength that other people don't possess, but because I had spent 40 years with a man who told me to keep my name on things and I had listened to him. That's the unsexy truth of how I survived it. Not courage, exactly. Not a dramatic awakening. Just the accumulated effect of 40 years of keeping my own house in order, which gave me somewhere to stand when someone tried to take the floor out from under me. I want to say something to you now, not as a character in a story, but as a person speaking to another person, which is what this has always been underneath everything else. If you are older and someone is asking you to trust them with your finances, your property, your estate, your future, trust them, and also know exactly what you have. Write it down. Keep it somewhere only you can access. Have an attorney whose loyalty is to you, and only to you. These two things should not be in conflict. If someone tells you they are in conflict, if someone says you don't need all that documentation because we're family, because I love you, because why would you need a lawyer? We're not that kind of family. That is the moment to pay very close attention. Love does not ask you to make yourself vulnerable in ways that only benefit the person asking. Family is not a claim that other people get to make on your body, your home, your money, or your dignity. Family is something that gets built, day by day, through showing up and telling the truth and protecting rather than taking. It can be built between blood relatives. It can be built between strangers. What it cannot be is assumed not by a child, not by a spouse, not by anyone who believes that the accident of relation entitles them to something that should have to be earned. I spent 72 years learning that lesson in pieces. The final piece cost me 6 weeks in a basement and almost cost me a great deal more. I am telling you this so that perhaps you learn it less expensively than I did. And if you are already in a version of what I was in, if you are already in a house where the rules don't quite add up, where the boundaries keep shifting in ways that don't benefit you, where you have been told, in small or large ways, that you should be grateful for whatever consideration is offered. I want you to hear this. You are not too old to leave. You are not too dependent to start over. You are not too far along in the story to write a different ending. Paperwork can be reorganized. The lease can be terminated. The attorney can be called. The daughter can be on a plane by Thursday. None of these things require you to be fearless. They only require you to make one small decision at a time, each one in the direction of yourself. The dinner ended around 9:30. People gathered coats and said their good nights. And Harriet called the car she had arranged in advance because she was, as she put it, 74 and smarter than she used to be about driving after a good bottle of wine. Claire and her husband were staying at a hotel 3 blocks away and walked, Claire hugging me at the door for the second time. That visit in a way that communicated more than the hug itself. Ethan was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway of my apartment with his coat on, and he looked at me the way he had been looking at me with increasing frequency over the past several months, like he was learning something about me, which seemed strange given that I was his mother, and he'd had 44 years to look. But I understood that he was seeing something he hadn't seen before, or hadn't allowed himself to see, which amounted to the same thing. "Thank you for inviting me," he said. "You're welcome," I said. "Mom," he paused. His hand was on the doorframe. "Do I still have a place here? Not I don't mean permanently. I don't mean anything about money or arrangements. I just mean," he stopped, "found it. In your life. Do I still have a place?" I looked at my son. At Gerald's jaw and Gerald's height, and the red-rimmed eyes of a man who had not been sleeping well for 8 months, and who had been, nonetheless, showing up. At the person I had raised, who had failed me in ways I was still working through, who was standing in my doorway asking a question that had no strategy in it. "You do," I said. "You're here because you're my son. Not because of anything else. Just that." He nodded once. His jaw did the thing it did when he was trying to hold himself together. He said good night and went down the hallway to the elevator, and I closed the door. I stood in my apartment for a moment, alone with the aftermath of a good dinner, the dishes, the glasses, the scattered evidence of people who had been present and were now gone, leaving the room warmer somehow than it had been before they arrived. Cleaned up slowly, without rushing. Washed the dishes by hand the way I prefer, dried them and put them away. Wiped down my oak table. Turned off the overhead light and left on the lamp in the corner, which made the room look the way a room should look at the end of an evening lived in. Softened. Real. I went to the window and stood where I always stand. At the southwest corner, where the city spreads out below in its nighttime pattern of light and dark. I thought about the basement. I let myself think about it, fully, without flinching. The furnace, the narrow bed, the folding table, the rectangle of gray sky. I let myself feel all of it one more time, not to punish myself with it, and not to use it as fuel for anger that I no longer needed to carry. Just to remember it clearly. To not let it become a story that was easier than the truth. And then I thought about this, the morning after I walked upstairs with the folder, before Ethan knocked on the door. Before any of it, I lay on that mattress in the dark, and I told myself I would not let this be the end of my story. It wasn't. This was a good dinner, a table I chose, people who came because they wanted to, my name on a lease that nobody negotiated without me, an armchair by a window where the light falls exactly right every afternoon, and a life that belongs completely and without negotiation to me. I turned off the lamp. I went to bed in my own room. I slept well. I want to say something to you now, not as a character in a story, but as a person speaking to another person, which is what this has always been underneath everything else. If you are older and someone is asking you to trust them with your finances, your property, your estate, your future, trust them, and also know exactly what you have. Write it down. Keep it somewhere only you can access. Have an attorney whose loyalty is to you, and only to you. These two things should not be in conflict. If someone tells you they are in conflict, if someone says you don't need all that documentation because we're family, because I love you, because why would you need a lawyer? We're not that kind of family. That is the moment to pay very close attention. Love does not ask you to make yourself vulnerable in ways that only benefit the person asking. Family is not a claim that other people get to make on your body, your home, your money, or your dignity. Family is something that gets built, day by day, through showing up and telling the truth and protecting rather than taking. It can be built between blood relatives. It can be built between strangers. What it cannot be is assumed not by a child, not by a spouse, not by anyone who believes that the accident of relation entitles them to something that should have to be earned. I spent 72 years learning that lesson in pieces. The final piece cost me 6 weeks in a basement and almost cost me a great deal more. I am telling you this so that perhaps you learn it less expensively than I did. And if you are already in a version of what I was in, if you are already in a house where the rules don't quite add up, where the boundaries keep shifting in ways that don't benefit you, where you have been told, in small or large ways, that you should be grateful for whatever consideration is offered, I want you to hear this. You are not too old to leave. You are not too dependent to start over. You are not too far along in the story to write a different ending. Paperwork can be reorganized. The lease can be terminated. The attorney can be called. The daughter can be on a plane by Thursday. None of these things require you to be fearless. They only require you to make one small decision at a time, each one in the direction of yourself. The dinner ended around 9:30. People gathered coats and said their good nights. And Harriet called the car she had arranged in advance because she was, as she put it, 74 and smarter than she used to be about driving after a good bottle of wine. Claire and her husband were staying at a hotel 3 blocks away and walked, Claire hugging me at the door for the second time. That visit in a way that communicated more than the hug itself. Ethan was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway of my apartment with his coat on, and he looked at me the way he had been looking at me with increasing frequency over the past several months, like he was learning something about me, which seemed strange given that I was his mother, and he'd had 44 years to look. But I understood that he was seeing something he hadn't seen before, or hadn't allowed himself to see, which amounted to the same thing. "Thank you for inviting me," he said. "You're welcome," I said. "Mom," he paused. His hand was on the doorframe. "Do I still have a place here? Not I don't mean permanently. I don't mean anything about money or arrangements. I just mean," he stopped. "Found it. In your life. Do I still have a place?" I looked at my son. At Gerald's jaw and Gerald's height, and the red-rimmed eyes of a man who had not been sleeping well for 8 months, and who had been, nonetheless, showing up. At the person I had raised, who had failed me in ways I was still working through, who was standing in my doorway asking a question that had no strategy in it. "You do," I said. "You're here because you're my son. Not because of anything else. Just that." He nodded once. His jaw did the thing it did when he was trying to hold himself together. He said good night and went down the hallway to the elevator, and I closed the door. I stood in my apartment for a moment, alone with the aftermath of a good dinner, the dishes, the glasses, the scattered evidence of people who had been present, and were now gone, leaving the room warmer somehow than it had been before they arrived. Cleaned up slowly, without rushing. Washed the dishes by hand the way I prefer, dried them and put them away. Wiped down my oak table. Turned off the overhead light and left on the lamp in the corner, which made the room look the way a room should look at the end of an evening lived in. Softened. Real. I went to the window and stood where I always stand, at the southwest corner where the city spreads out below in its nighttime pattern of light and dark. I thought about the basement. I let myself think about it, fully, without flinching. The furnace, the narrow bed, the folding table, the rectangle of gray sky. I let myself feel all of it one more time, not to punish myself with it, and not to use it as fuel for anger that I no longer needed to carry. Just to remember it clearly. To not let it become a story that was easier than the truth. And then I thought about this. The morning after I walked upstairs with the folder, before Ethan knocked on the door, before any of it, I lay on that mattress in the dark, and I told myself I would not let this be the end of my story. This was a good dinner, a table I chose, people who came because they wanted to, my name on a lease that nobody negotiated without me, an armchair by a window where the light falls exactly right every afternoon, and a life that belongs completely and without negotiation to me. I turned off the lamp. I went to bed in my own room. I slept well.